Montana Territory, May 1884. The wind howled through the cottonwoods behind the cabin, but Delaney Greer barely heard it. Her ears were full of her baby's cries and her own heartbeat pounding in her throat. The fire in the stove had gone low, the last split log burning out to a soft orange glow. She had not eaten since yesterday. She could not remember the last time she had slept. Outside the window, the sky was pale and wide with early dawn, stretching over the empty prairie that had not seen another soul in weeks. He was not coming back. Delaney sat with her back against the rough wall, cradling her newborn son against her chest. His name was Owen. He had blue eyes like hers and a soft mouth that never stopped searching for her warmth. She had named him alone, birthed him alone. And now, she would raise him alone. Because 3 days after Owen was born, Elias had saddled up and ridden out. He had not said goodbye. There was no note, no promise. Just a man who had looked at a crying baby and a pale, shaking woman and decided he did not want either. Delaney had watched him ride off from the porch, bleeding and fevered and still too weak to stand for long. She had waited a day. Then 2. Then 10. But the truth settled over her like the first frost of winter. Elias Greer was gone. And she had no one. Until the cowboy rode in. It was a little past noon when she heard the hoofs. Delaney stood slowly, one hand on the wall, the other clutching Owen to her chest. The baby whimpered in his swaddle. She stepped to the window, heart hammering, expecting Elias or fearing worse. But the man who stepped down from the saddle was not her husband. He was younger than Elias by a few years, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dust-covered trail clothes and a faded blue shirt. He had a clean face and dark hair tucked under his hat. In one hand, he carried a canvas sack. In the other, a bottle of milk sealed tight with cork. He looked up at the cabin, his eyes scanning the porch, the dead garden beds, the woodpile gone to nothing. Then he knocked gently. Delaney opened the door halfway and stared at him. "I am not here to make trouble," he said. "Name's Abram Keller. I was passing through, heading east toward Fort Benton. Saw smoke from the chimney yesterday. Looks like you could use some help." She said nothing. Owen started to cry softly against her shoulder. Abram lifted the sack. "Brought some cloth. And milk. Figured I might find someone in need, this far out." Delaney blinked hard. Her throat tightened. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." He did. Quietly. Without comment or question. He set the sack and bottle on the table and glanced around the one-room cabin. He did not stare at her. He did not ask where the man of the house was. She handed Owen into the crook of her arm and took the milk with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Abram nodded once. "You got a fire going?" "Barely. I will split you some wood." He did not wait for her to answer. He stepped outside, pulled an axe from under his saddle, and got to work. Delaney moved like a sleepwalker, pouring the milk into the tin cup, warming it over the low flame. Owen drank slowly, settling against her chest. When Abram came back inside, the child had fallen asleep. "I do not have much to offer," she said. "Not asking for anything." She looked at him then. Really looked. His jaw was square, his eyes steady. There was something calm about him. Like he had seen hard things but never let them change him. "You said your name is Abram Keller?" He nodded. "I am Delaney. This is Owen." "My husband," she stopped. Her voice cracked. He left. Abram did not flinch. He just looked toward the baby and then back at her. "Then he is a fool." Delaney turned away. Her shoulders shook once. She pressed her lips together tight. "I will not stay long," Abram said gently. "Just wanted to make sure you had what you needed. I can ride out by dusk." She looked around. The floor needed sweeping. The stove needed more wood. The roof still leaked when it rained. "You could stay for supper," she said. "If you will help me catch a rabbit." He smiled, slow and quiet, like he was not used to smiling much. I can do that. They sat at the table after sundown, with the baby in a basket beside the stove. Delaney had not eaten meat in 4 days. She closed her eyes after the first bite, just for a second. You from around here? Abram asked. Iowa. Came west with Elias 2 years back. Thought we would build something. He waited. We lost our first baby last spring. Then I got pregnant again. After Owen was born, Elias changed. Or maybe he always was like that, and I just did not see it. Abram did not offer pity. He just listened. I do not know how to make it through the next week. You already made it through the hardest part, he said. You are still standing. That says something. She looked down at her hands. I do not want to be alone out here. You are not. He was looking at her again. Steady. Sure. Later, when the baby woke crying, Abram was the one who rocked him while Delaney heated more milk. She watched from the stove, her hands shaking less now. Do you know how to hold a baby? She asked. He smiled again, eyes on Owen's tiny hand curled around his thumb. Raised 3 younger sisters after my ma passed. Got used to it. Delaney leaned against the wall and breathed. That night, she laid the baby in the cradle and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind had stopped. The prairie was quiet. There was a man sleeping on the floor near the stove. A stranger. But not really. She had let him in. And something in her chest felt steadier than it had in weeks. Maybe days like this meant something. Maybe a man who showed up with cloth and milk could stay. In the days that followed, Abram didn't ride on. He didn't say why, and Delaney didn't ask. He rose early, always before she did, and by the time she stepped into the yard with Owen in her arms, she'd find water hauled, kindling stacked, or the garden beds quietly cleared of the worst weeds. He worked like a man used to the rhythm of solitude, not rushing anything, not expecting thanks. Delaney watched him from the porch one morning as he repaired the fence near the south edge of the property, sleeves rolled to the elbow. A quiet steadiness in his movements reminded her of her father, who had died before she ever left the cornfields of Iowa. There was no posturing in Abram, no noise. He just did what needed doing. Inside, Owen stirred in his cradle. She crouched beside him, adjusting the quilt. His tiny fingers found her wrist and clung there. The warmth of his grip anchored her to something steady for the first time in weeks. When she stepped outside again, Abram was leaning on the fence rail, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. She brought him a tin cup of water, held it out without a word. He took it with a nod. You got a good windbreak along the west line. That'll keep the worst of it off come fall. My father taught me to plant willow for that, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. We dug saplings from the river bank this spring before we left Iowa. He studied the trees a moment. Smart man. He was, she said, then hesitated. I didn't think I'd ever hear someone say that about him out here. Folks think you lose your worth when you don't have land or a strong back anymore. Worth doesn't vanish because circumstances do. Abram's voice was even, but something behind it caught her attention, a worn edge, maybe. I've known men with nothing who knew more about dignity than those with 1,000 acres. You sound like someone who's lost things, too. He met her eyes. I buried my pa when I was 12. My ma 2 years later. I raised my sisters until they were grown. After that, I took to cattle drives. Never stayed long in one place. Delaney felt the words settle between them like dust on a windowsill, quiet, undisturbed, real. Did you ever think about settling? She asked. I did once, he said, glancing toward the horizon. But it was her father's land, and I wasn't enough for him. I left before she had to choose. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The silence didn't stretch awkwardly. It just lived there, like the grass and the wind and the faint creak of the fence. Later that afternoon, she found him in the barn mending the broken harness. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You're good with your hands, she said. He glanced up. Wasn't always. Spent the first month after my first drive near starving 'cause I didn't know how to patch a boot. She smiled. I didn't know how to bake bread without my mother's recipe until this year. Burned the first 3 loaves so bad I used them to patch a hole in the barn wall. He chuckled low and surprised, like he hadn't heard his own laughter in a while. The sun dropped low behind the hills, and the smell of hay and old leather filled the barn. She stepped inside, closer now. Why did you really stop here? She asked. He looked down at his hands. I saw the smoke, and I thought someone might need help. But after the first night, I didn't feel like leaving. Delaney's chest tightened. Not with pain, not exactly. With something else. Something that felt like hope, but brittle. I've been waiting for the day I could breathe again, she said. You being here, it's the first time the air hasn't felt too heavy. He didn't move toward her. He just stood there, still as stone, letting the moment settle. You don't know me anything, Delaney, he said, voice low. I'm not here to take. I know, she said. That's why I let you stay. They didn't touch, not yet. But something passed between them, something sure and slow and certain. Not a promise, not yet. Just the beginning of trust. That night, after Owen fell asleep, she stepped out onto the porch and found him sitting on the stairs, arms resting on his knees, eyes on the stars. She sat beside him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. Do you miss the road? She asked. He shook his head. Not tonight. And she believed him. The creek ran fuller now, fed by meltwater from the last of the high snow. Abram stood knee-deep in it, sleeves rolled back as he hauled a trout from the current with a flick of his wrist. The fish thrashed once, then stilled against the grip of his palm. Up the rise, Delaney knelt in the grass, her skirt tucked beneath her knees, Owen swaddled beside her in a basket set in the shade of a cottonwood. She was gathering wild onion, fingers dirt-streaked, hair pinned up loosely against the breeze. From time to time, she glanced down the slope. Not to check on Owen, he was sleeping soundly, but at the figure in the stream. When Abram climbed back up the bank, his boots soaked and his shirt clinging to his back, she handed him a bundle of greens without looking up. You always this quiet when you fish? She asked. He crouched beside her, laying the trout in the pail. Only when it matters. You make everything feel like it matters. He tucked the fish beneath a layer of wet cloth. That's because it does. She looked at him, face steady, but her voice was softer than usual. Folks talk about surviving out here like it's just grit and calluses. But I think it's the small things that get you through. A warm meal. Someone who doesn't look away. He reached toward her basket and adjusted the blanket around Owen's feet. He's a good sleeper. He wasn't, at first. I used to pace the floor for hours. I'd hum the same hymn over and over. I think I was humming it more for myself than for him. She smiled faintly. Now he just needs to hear breathing close by. Abram's hand lingered on the edge of the basket. He's not the only one. She didn't answer that. Just looked out toward the horizon, where the grass moved like water in the wind. They walked back to the cabin together, Abram carrying the fish and Delaney with the basket cradled against her hip. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just full. Inside, she laid Owen in the cradle and set the onions on the table. Abram cleaned the trout at the washbasin, and Delaney stoked the stove. I meant to ask, she said after a while. Why Fort Benton? He rinsed his hands and dried them on a strip of linen. My sister's youngest is there. Got married to a barber's son last year. They've got a baby now. I hadn't met him yet. Do you still plan to go? He looked at her then, really looked. No one's waiting on me there. Not anymore. She turned back to the stove, pressing her lips together. Then what do you want now? He sat in the chair nearest the door, elbows on his knees. That's a question I've asked myself every morning lately. But today, I think I have an answer. She didn't press him for it. She let him speak on his own time. I want to build something, he said finally. Not just fences or sheds. Something that keeps. Delaney folded the onions into the skillet, the scent rising soft and sharp. You think that's possible? Out here? I think it depends who's building it with you. She stirred the pan once, then turned to face him, her voice quiet. I've stopped expecting people to stay. I haven't left. She stepped toward him. No. You haven't. Outside, the wind picked up again, tugging at the eaves. Abram stood and crossed the room. He reached for her hand and held it lightly, like he wasn't sure she'd allow it. But she didn't pull away. I can't offer more than what I am, he said. But I won't walk out that door unless you asked me to. Her answer came without hesitation. Don't. He nodded once, relief flickering behind his eyes. That night, after supper, Abram stepped out to check the shed roof. Delaney sat in the doorway with Owen asleep in her arms, watching the last light fall across the field. When Abram returned, he crouched beside her and looked down at the baby, who had stirred but not woken. She's got your hands, he murmured. Delaney's breath caught. What? Abram swallowed and looked up. I thought you knew. Owen is a girl. Delaney blinked, her mouth parting, then she laughed quiet and stunned. I didn't. I hadn't even looked. I was too scared to lose her. Abram reached out and touched the baby's tiny curled fingers. You haven't lost her. And you're not alone. Delaney rested her head against the doorframe, eyes brimming but unashamed. I think I want to rename her. Abram waited. She looked down at the child, then whispered, Clara. After my mother. He smiled, and this time it reached all the way to his eyes. Clara Greer. That's a name that'll carry. She nodded slowly, her hand finding his again. So will hers. If she's got your steadiness. They sat there as night fell, hand in hand, with the baby sleeping between them and the prairie hushed around the cabin. Neither needed to say what already lived in the space between their hearts. By the end of June, the days stretched long and golden, and the grass around the cabin reached high enough to whisper against Delaney's skirts when she walked. The mornings came warmer now, and Clara squirmed in her swaddle, cheeks flushed, her small cries softer, less urgent. Delaney had started letting her nap under the lean-to when the breeze was steady. Abram had built a shade frame from willow boughs and canvas, and in its dappled light Clara slept easy. Inside, the cabin had changed. The tools were hung straight. The hearth swept. A cradle now stood where an empty chair had once been. Abram had crafted it out of pine, shaping the slats with a draw knife he'd found rusting in the shed. He hadn't said anything when he set it down beside the stove, just nodded once when Delaney ran her fingers along the smooth edge. That morning, she found him mending a saddle strap beside the barn, leather stretched across his knee. The sun caught the edge of his jaw, shadowing his face as he worked. She stopped a few paces away, arms folded. You always fix things that don't belong to you. He didn't look up. Only if they're worth keeping. She stepped closer, brushing a thumb over the cracked leather. I forgot it was even in there. Doesn't mean it stopped being useful. Delaney sat on the edge of the trough, skirts gathered above her boots. You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't turned down that trail toward our ridge? He tied off the thread and set the needle aside. Sometimes. But then I think about how things feel right here. And I don't wonder long. Delaney pulled a strand of dry grass from her hem. I haven't heard a wagon in over a month. No trader, no circuit preacher. It's just us out here. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That bother you? No, she said quietly. It feels like everything unnecessary got stripped away. And what's left is steady. Abram met her eyes. You don't miss town? I used to. I don't anymore. She looked past him, toward the slope where the sun had already dried the dew. I think I was always meant for something quieter. Then maybe you were meant for this. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That afternoon, Abram hitched the mule and cart and rode out toward the river flats. He returned near dusk with burlap sacks of stone and 3 cedar posts balanced across the cart bed. Delaney stood in the doorway with Clara in her arms, watching as he unloaded. "You building something I should know about?" He glanced up, a rare flicker of hesitation in his face. "Figured the garden could use a border. Animals been poking through the soft edge." She shifted Clara to her other hip. "That's not all." "No," he admitted. "I was thinking about a second room. Just a small one. For when she's older." Delaney looked down at Clara. The child blinked sleepily, one fist curled against her cheek. "You think we'll still be here then?" Abram stepped closer. "I'd like to be." She looked up slowly. "You sure about that?" "I don't leave what I mean to keep," he said. Delaney swallowed. "I don't want to be someone's duty, Abram." "You're not," he said. "You're someone I choose." She didn't reply right away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. Clara made a soft sound, and Delaney tucked the blanket more snugly around her. Then she stepped forward just one step and laid her free hand flat on his chest. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. He laid his palm over hers. "Then let's build something that lasts." It wasn't a question. And she didn't need to answer. Not with words. That evening they ate by lamplight. Clara slept in the cradle Abram had built with his own hands. Delaney set a second plate across from hers without hesitation. When Abram reached for her hand across the table, she didn't hesitate either. Outside, the stars blinked into place one by one, steady and sure above the plains. And inside the cabin, something strong and quiet had begun to root. July brought heat that settled into the cracks of the cabin walls and turned the soil to dust by mid-afternoon. Delaney rose early now, before the sun cleared the ridge, while the air still held a trace of cool. Abram had begun digging post holes for the addition, spacing them carefully along the north side of the cabin. He worked shirtless in the mornings, sweat darkening the linen at his collarbones, and Delaney found her gaze drawn to the quiet focus in his face as he measured and worked. She didn't speak much while he labored. She brought water, sometimes a strip of salted pork folded into bread, but she didn't interrupt. She'd been alone long enough to know how men guarded their rhythm when their hands were busy. One morning, she stepped out with Clara swaddled against her chest and watched him pressing a cedar beam into place. He paused, eyes narrowing as he tested the weight. "There's a carpenter in Fort Shaw," she said. "He charged us $3 for a doorframe that didn't even close right." Abram glanced over his shoulder. "I'd rather trust my own 2 hands than pay for someone else's guesswork." Delaney shifted Clara higher. "You never told me how you learned to build." He climbed down from the ladder and poured water from the tin pail. "Trail boss I worked under used to take side jobs fixing barns. Said if you can read the grain and feel the weight, the wood'll tell you what it wants to be. And what does this wood want?" He looked at the half-framed wall. "To shelter something that matters." She ran her hand along the doorway that would become Clara's room. "Then it's in the right place." They didn't say more. The sun climbed higher, and Clara began to fuss. Delaney slipped back inside, humming something low and wordless. The sound drifted through the open window as Abram returned to the ladder, driving nails with even strokes. That evening, they sat on the porch steps while Clara slept in the cradle. The sky had turned a dusky violet, the prairie stretching away in soft shadow. Abram leaned against the post, arms loose across his knees. "I've been thinking about the land," he said quietly. "You've got near 30 acres that haven't been cleared. The soil's tired, but it could take potatoes. Maybe winter rye." Delaney folded her arms around herself. "Elias never walked more than a quarter mile past the fence line. Said it was pointless if we couldn't plow it. He was wrong." "I know." He turned his head toward her. "Would you let me help you work it? Not just patch what's broken. Start something new." She didn't answer right away. The air smelled of warm grass and the faint char of the evening cook fire. She thought of the years ahead, of Clara toddling through rows of green, of laughter rolling through the open window. "Yes," she said. "If we do it together." Abram reached out and took her hand, his callous fingers brushing the inside of her wrist. "I want to stay. Not just through summer. Not just till she's grown." Delaney met his gaze, steady as the land beneath them. "Then stay as my partner. Not just in work." He stood and drew her to her feet, resting his palm against her cheek. "I've loved you since the first night I saw you hold her. I just didn't know how to say it without rushing what's real." She reached up and covered his hand with her own. "You don't need to say it again. I already know." He kissed her there, under the wide Montana sky, not in hunger or haste but with the warmth of something long deserved. She pressed into it, fingers curling into the fabric at his chest, the world narrowing to breath and heartbeat, and the quiet certainty of being chosen, not by chance, but by care. That night Abram moved his bedroll from the corner of the cabin. He didn't ask, and Delaney didn't speak. She simply turned down the quilt beside her, and he lay beside her as if he'd always belonged there. Clara stirred only once, and Delaney rose to soothe her, Abram's hand brushing her back as she passed. In the weeks that followed, the new room took shape. They lined the inside with muslin and filled the cracks with sheep wool. Abram carved a cradle from juniper for when Clara outgrew the pine one. Delaney planted a row of young apple trees along the east rise, a gift from a trader who passed through with seedlings. They registered a claim for the untouched acres, Abram signing beside her. The circuit judge came through by wagon one clear August morning, and Delaney wore her mother's brooch while Abram stood beside her, hat in hand, Clara cradled between them. The vows were simple. No guests, no fanfare. Just two people looking each other full in the face and saying yes. That fall, they harvested potatoes the size of a man's fist. Abram built a smokehouse and taught Delaney how to cure venison. Clara learned to sit up by the hearth, her laugh bright and unexpected, a sound that never failed to draw Abram's eyes from his work. They spent their evenings reading by lamplight, Abram's voice low and sure as he sounded out passages from a tattered volume of Whitman he'd carried west years ago. Delaney stitched new curtains from flour sacks. They hung them together, Abram holding the rod steady while Clara kicked her heels against his chest, giggling. Snow came early that year, but the cabin stayed warm. Abram filled the wood box without being asked. Delaney baked with dried herbs she'd foraged in spring. They slept with Clara in a trundle beside the bed, her breath soft in the quiet. They didn't speak often of the past. It had shaped them, yes, but it no longer defined them. What mattered now was the land beneath their boots, the child between them, the love built not from promises but from presence. And in that presence, in every fence post sunk, every loaf shared, every laugh coaxed from silence, they found not just survival, but peace. They never spoke of forever. They just lived it.